Hey guys, this video is for APUS for my juniors. This is your asynchronous video for Tuesday. We won't have one on Wednesday, obviously, because Wednesday is no school. So I'm not going to leave a video for Wednesday. So watch this one from start to finish, and then your next time we'll talk will be during our live class. All right, so today we're going to talk about critics of life in the 1920s. Because there were a lot of people who just didn't like the way things were going in the 1920s. A lot of people kind of viewed the 20s as just a time of conservative politics, monotonous assembly lines, mindless worship of celebrities. So a lot of critics thought life in the 1920s was really not something that, should really be looked up to at all. A lot of excuse me, a lot of people who were living in the 1920s, remember this is before the Great Depression, thought that these were the good times, the Roaring 20s. Remember they called them. Because things seem to be going well, right? You go to the movies. There are a lot of jobs available. The government wasn't doing much of anything, but it didn't seem to really need to do much of anything. So a lot of people were, in fact, the majority of people, I would say, were content with life in the 1920s, but not everybody was, particularly artists and writers. A lot of them kind of saw life in the 1920s as meaningless almost. And in many ways, there was a crisis of values after the First World War. And we talked about it, a lot of people just became very disillusioned, right? The World War I was supposed to be fought for all these high ideals, and then it turned out that everything we had fought for, in the eyes of many, was not achieved. There was really no point to the war. We basically had a system in place where we just kind of returned to kind of like the pre-war, even pre 20th century mindset, of unlimited business, of foreign policy isolationism. So a lot of the idealism of the war years was completely gone by the 1920s, and this really disillusioned a lot of people, particularly writers, as we said. A lot of these people were just shocked by what they thought was the very ordinariness of life in the 1920s. When we had these active presidents before, we had Teddy Roosevelt, we had Woodrow Wilson, we had all these high ideals, all these possibilities, that government could actually improve people's lives. That the United States could actually be a beacon of liberty and reform the world. So all these high ideals were just gone by the 20s, and a lot of people were just like, things are just so ordinary, so bourgeois, so blah, in general. So a lot of these critics, especially the ones who were writers, formed a group that was later called the Lost Generation. And these lost generation of writers in the 1920s were just people who were disillusioned with 1920s life and felt it was superficial and without really any meaning at all. Probably the most famous writer of the lost generation in the 1920s was F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, I don't know what you read in English now, but when I was in 11th grade, we read The Great Gatsby, which was F. Scott Fitzgerald's most famous book, which was really a critique of the whole American myth of the self-made man. So a lot of these lost generation writers were not just dissatisfied with life in the 20s, but were just very dissatisfied in general with the American way of life. F. Scott Fitzgerald was probably the most famous chronicler and critic of life in the 1920s. He wrote a book called, his first major book was called This Side of Paradise, which was written in 1920. It was about, kind of like young people just meaninglessly strolling across Europe, because their life just seemed kind of rootless, and they were trying to search for like some deeper meaning of life. And Fitzgerald particularly critiqued the materialism of the 1920s. Remember, we talked about that. Everybody kind of wanted like all these new products. The advertising was just kind of selling a lot of people on all these new inventions, and all these new consumer goods. And Fitzgerald and a lot of lost generation writers kind of felt like that's all people care about now, just materialism. So it kind of made life, again, meaningless. All gods are dead, Fitzgerald wrote. All wars have been fought. All faith in man has been shaken. So he was quite cynical about life in the 1920s. And of course his most famous work, The Great Gatsby, which is still, I assume, a staple of of high school English curriculums. And it's timeless. So even though it's particularly a critique of 1920s life, it's really a more general critique. I don't want to give anything away, but it's a more general critique of just kind of like you know the American way of life and all the American myths Fitzgerald was trying to knock down in the Great Gatsby. I won't go any further because you might be reading it at some point. Now, in other prominent cultural critic of life in the 1920s was one of my favorites, H.L. Mencken. Now, H.L. Mencken was Mark Twain-like. I'm a huge, remember from last year's videos, I'm a huge Mark Twain fan. And he critiqued, like Twain did, H.L. Mencken, who wrote for a newspaper called the Baltimore Sun, he critiqued just like a lot of, just like a lot of the standard things that a lot of Americans believe, particularly organized religion. He wrote in newspapers. He had a syndicated column. He wrote in magazines, and he basically condemned everything. He condemned, or well, maybe the condemned is a little bit strong, but he critiqued everything. Organized religion. He was actually the main newspaper reporter chronicling the Scopes Monkey trial, which we're actually going to talk about next week probably. Which was where a teacher was put on trial for teaching his class about evolution. To H.L. Mencken, it was just kind of symbolic of, just how narrow-minded and ignorant a lot of Americans were. He critiqued government. He critiqued middle class values in general. He once asked the question, and then answered it: why do people visit zoos? Well, no, well, that was the answer. The question was, why do people come to America? And then he answered, well, why do people visit zoos? So it was a pretty savage critique. Mencken himself lost me kind of like when we got into the 1930s. Mencken became a really big critic of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and attempts by the government to try to improve people's lives. Some of his writings took on almost anti-Semitic overtones toward the end. So I wasn't a fan of H.L. Mencken in the 30s and 40s, but like the H.L. Mencken of the 1920s really had some really important observations to share about about life in the United States during the 1920s. There were also some writers who were just in the lost generation who were critics of the whole small town American ideal. Sinclair Lewis, a prominent writer of the 1920s. Some of his books, he wrote a book called Main Street, which kind of like critiqued like small town America and small town American values. And then there was a book, probably his most famous work, called Babbitt, where he basically told the story of just kind of like a middle class real estate salesman who was kind of fake and was just kind of putting on all sorts of airs in order to kind of conform to small town American life, and was kind of a phony. That book actually gave rise to the term Babbittism, which kind of described a kind of person like the character in that book who was just like hopelessly conformist and trying to conform to a society that was that had a lot of problems. And a lot of men of the time, were trying to fit in, trying to make a good living for themselves, and they kind of fit into that whole Babbitt model. So that book actually was quite a success. One of the most famous lost generation writers was Ernest Hemingway. I like Ernest Hemingway quite a lot, and Ernest Hemingway, even though some people argue that Hemingway was very male centric in his writing, and I could see that. that critique. But Ernest Hemingway was particularly disillusioned by his experience in World War One. He had been an ambulance driver during the war, and he had kind of bought into a lot of the ideals of the war, and he was just very disillusioned after the war was over, and failed to achieve a lot of the ideals that he believed the war was all about. And after the war, he basically lived as an expatriate living in Paris. Paris was kind of the center of a lot of Americans who just were so fed up with American life that they decided to just critique it and write about it in Paris. Um, that was kind of like the go-to place for a lot of these lost generation writers. And Hemingway lived as an expatriate in Paris, along with a lot of other lost generation writers. Some of his works, the sun also rises, which talks about youthful drift across Europe, and a book that I read when I was your age and made quite an impression on me. A book called Farewell to Arms, which was semi-autobiographical and was kind of a harsh critique of war in general and all the false ideals and illusions that come with war. Um, this is a passage from the book Farewell to Arms. I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, sacrifice, and the expression in vain. We had read them on proclamations that were slapped on top of other proclamations for a very long time. But in reality, I have seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like the meat stockyards if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. So a really kind of savage critique of the false illusions of World War One. I'd really recommend that book, A Farewell to Arms. It's very, very good. Um, Another prominent writer of the time, a man named William Faulkner. William Faulkner, wrote particularly about life in the Old South and basically trying to say how ossified and life was there. One of Faulkner's famous lines is the past is never dead. It's not even the past. Which is really a good line to remember as we study history. Poetry. Ezra Pound was a prominent lost generation poet of the 1920s. This is what he said about the United States: an old bitch civilization gone in the teeth. Ezra Pound became so disillusioned that he actually went the other way and began embracing fascism in the 1930s and 1940s. Eugene O'Neill, who was probably I like a lot of writers from this era. Apparently, he's my favorite playwright. He also kind of critiqued not just the American way of life, but also just like a lot of the false ideals we kind of talk ourselves into believing. And the Iceman Cometh, The Long Day's Journey into Night, some of his famous plays, which were very, very good. He focused on alcoholism a lot, the effect that alcoholism actually has on families and mental illness. I think that was something that he was actually like dealing with in his own family. And Greenwich Village, the village, was kind of the center of life for artists in the United States. So a lot of the lost generation writers were stationed in Paris, critiquing America from 3,000 miles away. But those who stay in America generally were kind of in the area of the village, even though of course they were everywhere. But that was kind of like um, ground zero for lost generation writers. Excuse me. So a lot of these writers just basically were critiquing the whole American way of life, particularly the materialism, consumerism, worship of celebrities. That was really common in the 1920s. Just basically say it was meaningless. So we went from high ideals to kind of like meaningless values. Lost generation writers believed. Now, a lot of people call the 1920s the Jazz Age. Now, jazz music was kind of the soundtrack of the 1920s. And jazz music, even though now it's considered very cultured and very sophisticated, jazz music was considered very, you know, avant-garde or at best, and sinful and decadent at worst. And probably more people were on that side, kind of believing that jazz music was just kind of like hedonistic. And a lot of people felt that way, to be honest, because the roots of jazz music are in the Black South. And a lot of black people, as they were moving north during the Great Migration of World War One, and then later on in the 1920s, because the Great Migration continued into the 20s. A lot of black Southerners brought their music traditions with them when they went up north, particularly in Chicago and New York. And Harlem was the center of black life in the north. The roots of that is because when Harlem is so far up in Manhattan that it was one of the few places that actually would rent to black people. So that was kind of the beginning, the origin story of Harlem being being the big black neighborhood in not only New York City, but the kind of the North in general. Harlem became identified with black culture. Now, jazz has its roots in New Orleans, and black people brought it up with them. When they went up north, but jazz music really became popular in mainstream America through white musicians. And the same thing happened with rock music in the 1950s, right? You know, the roots of rock music are in the Black South, but then it was popularized by white musicians like Elvis and Jerry Lewis and all those guys. So jazz music 30 years earlier in the 1920s kind of followed a similar trajectory. It was very it had its roots in the Black South, but then got more popular and white musicians began playing jazz. But mainstream America saw jazz. I love jazz, but mainstream America in the 1920s kind of saw jazz as vulgar and as rebellious. And jazz was the desired music for a lot of upper class Northerners. Whites. A lot of white people actually went to jazz clubs and nightclubs at night and listened to all the edgy music that the black people were playing. But then later became popularized by white musicians. And there was Ken Burns. Ken Burns is the guy who makes all those documentaries. Ken Burns actually said he made a documentary about jazz, and he called jazz the only uniquely American art form. That everything else has its roots somewhere else, but jazz music, the origin of jazz music is the United States, and that's a very, very interesting statement. Now, at a time when Jim Crow was kind of alive and well in the American South, we have this artistic flourishing of music with its roots in the Black South taking place throughout northern cities. And if we were in class, I'd actually play you some jazz music of the era. Probably the man who popularized it the most was, but jazz purists would say watered down significantly, was George Gershwin. George Gershwin actually kind of mainstreamed jazz music. And some of the stuff is absolutely gorgeous. If anybody's heard Rhapsody in Blue, which is a 17-minute piece, but it is absolutely fantastic. Now, the Jazz Age and the whole image of the 1920s being the Jazz Age was in many ways a media creation. The most Americans, most regular Americans living their lives were not really so into jazz music, but the people who were kind of writing about life in the 1920s, people who were more avant-garde actually were into jazz music. But this whole image of the jazz age, that it was basically this hedonistic time. If anybody's seen the play Chicago, that's kind of like reflects the whole myth of the 1920s being the jazz age. But this whole idea of it being this hedonistic age with jazz as the background music was kind of the media kind of created this image of the 1920s in that way, but when that only represented like a small element of American society. But one thing that was correct for sure, mass culture and hedonism and materialism was the way that a lot of people did live in the 1920s. If anybody's ever heard the song for Chicago nowadays, it's good, isn't it great, isn't it swell, isn't it fun, isn't it nowadays? And that was written decades after the 1920s, but it also kind of like continues to reflect this idea of the 1920s kind of being this decadent, hedonistic time. We were going to nightclubs, listening to jazz music, drinking illegal alcohol, and just kind of obsessed with consumerism. But again, more media creation than reality. All right, guys, very good. So, I'm sorry I don't get to play you some jazz music. That's what I usually do when we're in person and we have this lesson. But in our next class, our live class on Thursday, we're going to talk about women in the 1920s, particularly the flappers. That's probably the most famous representation of women of the time, and also how Black Americans were living in the 1920s. We'll be talking about that as well. All right, guys. So I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.